may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
All right, we got some pretty exciting things going on here, where first we have an official date, time, and location for our official Flock meetup that is going to be happening before I go to Florida. Now, please, guys, if you are on the fence, whether you're going to go or not, please come out. This is going to be the only Flock meetup that we probably ever have in Texas. So if you have any interest meeting some other fantasy football fans of the channel, if you have any interest in meeting myself, come out to the meetup. It's going to be held at King Brewery, where I'm hoping they don't mind about 20 of us pulling up, but it's going to be on July 19th on a Saturday at 6 p.m. I just chose this location because it's outdoors. They have very large tables. They sell beer. They also have parking. So I figured that it was going to be a decent spot for us. Obviously, this isn't an ad or anything. I just went through and was trying to figure out what was going to work for everyone. And the second thing I have is an announcement that we are going to be making extra podcasts close to every single day over there on Patreon. And I realized this, that on Patreon, I spend so much time, literally hours every day, just writing up dynasty teams, writing up 2021 redraft teams, and what my breakdown at each position, as well as the strategy for the league is, and trying to advocate for some people to make some trades in certain scenarios. And I went, you know what? Let's try to cut this down. So I figured it would be a little bit easier for me to go through and make a 10-minute podcast on your team. And I didn't want to just send the podcast to you. So I decided to go through and upload it for everybody over there on Patreon. So of course, if you want your team broken down, shoot me a DM over there. Or if not, maybe you enjoy just listening to some other team breakdowns. But that's it. Let's dive into this and let's talk about an offense that I think is going to be bringing in so much value for fantasy football players in 2021. Now, I will admit I was not really drafting any of them, but let's not focus in on 2020. That was last year. We'll talk about what happened. I'm glad we weren't drafting them because they were being overdrafted, but now it's the time to buy in. Let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens, starting it off with Lamar Jackson. And here with Lamar Jackson, okay, so obviously he was being drafted as the quarterback 1 in fantasy drafts last year. If you wanted to take him, if you were playing in a high-stakes redraft league, you were having to take him as the first quarterback off the board at the very beginning of the third round. I mean, it was a common stack for you to see Lamar Jackson go at either at the end of the second, the beginning of the third, and then the same team was most of the time taking Mark Andrews with their other pick. They were going Lamar Jackson at the end of the second, Mark Andrews at the beginning of the third to get that very valuable stack in fantasy. And the reason they were doing this was because Lamar Jackson had an elite 2019 season. I mean, if you look back with Lamar Jackson in 2019, he was the definition of a league winner. I mean, he was the quarterback 1 in fantasy. Now, it was pretty much like Christian McCaffrey at the quarterback position. Not only was he the quarterback 1, but he was the quarterback 1 by a wide margin, where he was averaging 28.8 points per game. And the second best quarterback there was averaging 23 points per game. I mean, it was just a massive gap of Lamar Jackson and the rest of the field. And obviously, in 2019, one of the reasons he was able to do this was with his elite rushing capabilities. But the reason that we were actually fading him at the quarterback 1 price after this elite season was because of his touchdown rate that he had in 2019. It was completely unsustainable. We know that Lamar Jackson and this Baltimore Ravens passing offense is never going to be as high volume as you would expect with a team like the Cincinnati Bengals, with the Kansas City Chiefs. They're always going to be a run-first football team. But in 2019, it didn't matter for Lamar Jackson because he went through and had 26 pass attempts a game, over 200 passing yards. But what was just a complete outlier, and this is why you kind of knew that Lamar Jackson wasn't going to be able to live up to his ADP last year, is because he averaged 2.4 passing touchdowns a game off of this very small volume. I mean, almost no volume, yet he was average with his passing touchdown volume. And he did this with a 9% touchdown rate. 9% of his pass attempts went for passing touchdowns. Now, if you go through and look throughout the entire NFL's history and going, where does this stack up? Because obviously I know a lot of people aren't familiar with touchdown passing rates, but it is such an outlier that Lamar Jackson was 16th in NFL history in his passing touchdown rate in 2019. Now, that is obviously ridiculous. Obviously, you're not expecting that to continue. And another place he was an outlier with, honestly, I wasn't too worried about this, but was with his rushing capabilities, where he averaged 80 rushing yards a game and half a rushing touchdown a game as well. So with Lamar Jackson, it was kind of obvious to see that his 2019 season was an outlier. You were going to have a hard time projecting him to be so far out ahead of the rest of the field at the quarterback position, because we knew that touchdown rate for his passing attempts were going to go down. And then if we go through and look at what happened in 2020, I mean, here he finished as the quarterback 8 in points per game. He finished at 23 points per game. Pretty much he was in a jumbled tier after you got outside of Josh Allen, Kyler Murray. They were all pretty much the same. And here you saw almost everything drop down across the board. What was very funny is how few pass attempts you actually had with Baltimore last year. I mean, the pass attempts kind of crater. You only see 183 passing yards a game, 1.7 passing touchdowns. But what you like to see is you like to see the touchdown rate fall, and that kind of gives us a little bit of clearance to go, this is sustainable. This is something that you don't have to run from, where he had 6.9% of his passing attempts turning into touchdowns. Now, this was still a very high mark. I mean, he was third in the NFL here, but you're naturally going to expect Lamar Jackson to be high because he is unlike a Drew Brees. He's unlike a Tom Brady. I mean, if the clear passing option isn't there, he can tuck it and run. So obviously the passing volume is not going to be up. He's going to have a lot of those quote unquote passing attempts for those pocket quarterbacks just not necessarily being a thing, because he doesn't have to make them. He can have something else going on in the ground. But what you love to see in 2020, and what makes me excited for his 2021 season, is he was able to maintain his rushing production. Now, it did come down slightly, but still, it was at a historic level with 67 rushing yards a game and half a rushing touchdown as well. So we're going through and we're looking at Lamar Jackson, and we're saying, hey, this is a quarterback that was literally the definition of a league winner back in 2019. He did so with an unsustainable touchdown rate, but now in 2020, he has that dip, and you're getting a discount in 2021. And what I want to focus in on with Lamar Jackson is when he had that unsustainable season in 2019. Let's look at who he was throwing to. Let's look at what Baltimore put around him for him to have this MVP type season. So let's go through and not just focus in on his top options. What I want to do is I want to look at the side pieces, the players that were getting consistently targeted that literally aren't good enough to be on an NFL roster. Now, some options on this list: Willie Snead had 11.4% of Lamar Jackson's pass attempts in 2019. Nick Boyle had 10.7%. Hayden Hurst, 9.7%. Seth Roberts, 8.7%. So the combination of Willie Snead, Nick Boyle, Hayden Hurst, and Seth Roberts had over 40% of Lamar Jackson's passing volume in 2019. Now we go through and we go, what is the wide receiver room going to look like in 2021? Well, now he gets an upgrade across the board. It doesn't matter what position you're looking at. So he has Rashod Bateman coming in out of Minnesota, a first-round draft pick from this past NFL draft. And more importantly than that, I mean, this team goes through and they really address the depth at the wide receiver position as well, where they take Devin Duvernay in the third round of last year's draft. The year prior, they took Miles Boykin in the third round. Also, this season, they take Tylan Wallace in the fourth, and they give Sammy Watkins, who I know is not going to be a fantasy option. I understand that. But if you look at what Sammy Watkins was able to do with clearing out space for the Kansas City Chiefs over the past 2 years, there's a reason that Baltimore gave him $8 million. So now, I mean, you're going from Willie Snead, Nick Boyle being significant contributors, where worst case scenario, the worst player that's going to get targeted on this team is maybe going to be Devin Duvernay, and that's not even that bad. So not only do you get an upgrade at wide receiver 1 going to Rashod Bateman, but also across the entire board, it doesn't matter. Every skill positional player out there for Lamar Jackson in 2021 is going to be a better option than what he had in 2019 and what he had in 2020. So you throw on the fact that Lamar Jackson saw that dip this past year, And yes, he's not going to ever reach that touchdown efficiency that he had in 2019. That was unsustainable. That's why you were fading him going into 2020, because we know that's volatile year to year. That's why you're fading Aaron Rodgers in 2021, despite anything to do with his team situation. You overlook that. You go, hey, the touchdown rate was unsustainable. You're not expecting a quarterback that's not going to have the rushing production to go through and have that elite ceiling again. But here, Lamar Jackson, we have seen it season over season over season. The rushing production is going to be there. We know how significant that is for fantasy football nowadays. Now, you throw in the fact that this is the best skill positional group he's ever had, and we know that quarterbacks just continue to develop through their NFL careers. And I know Lamar Jackson probably isn't going to be someone that is a league-winning quarterback by the time he gets to 33, 34 years old like a Russell Wilson. That's not his game, but he's 24 right now. Lamar Jackson, he won leagues in 2019. He is going to win leagues again this year. He's going in the 5th round of drafts this year compared to being a late 2nd, early 3rd round pick in 2020. So I'm going to be 100% buying the dip here. His situation is significantly better. His price is cut in half. That's what you try to identify in fantasy. Now, if we are overlooking Lamar Jackson a little bit and we're going, hey, we drafted Lamar in the 5th. Now what we have to do is we have to go through and look for some stacking options, because y'all know that what we talk about all the time on this channel is how you definitely need to be stacking with how many studies there have been done to show that's going to increase your win rate in fantasy, whether or not it's DFS, whether or not it's redraft, whether or not it's dynasty. You need to be chasing stacks. And what's nice about Lamar Jackson is he is going before all of his pass catching options. So you don't really have to plan it out before the draft. You kind of can just sit there and wait and go, okay, if Lamar falls to a range that we like, let's take Lamar, and then we can target his stacks afterwards. And now there are going to be a couple different options here. Obviously, the most expensive option is going to be Mark Andrews, who is currently going in the 6th round of redraft leagues. And with Mark Andrews, I mean, this is another scenario where you're getting a massive, massive discount based on where he was going last year. Last year, we already talked about a lot of teams stacking Lamar and Mark Andrews at the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd round. Well, now you can do the same thing with Mark Andrews going in the 6th. Say you get a team that you have that 1st overall pick, right? And you go, okay, we have the 1st overall pick. Let's wait until maybe at the very end of the 5th, we have Lamar Jackson available to us. And then once we get to the 6th, we have Mark Andrews as well. And I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. You're going to be doing that if you draft from the 12th spot. I apologize about that. But nonetheless, I really like the idea of stacking Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews at the turn. Now, if you look at Mark Andrews, he's a player that earlier on in his NFL career, before they traded away Hayden Hurst, he was an elite tight end off of literally no snaps. I mean, this was a player that was historically efficient with his fantasy points per snap, fantasy points per route run, to a point where literally the only other guys that you could look at were Aaron Hernandez and Rob Gronkowski. They were the only players in the same tier. And like we said, with Lamar Jackson from that 2019 season, that was not sustainable. You're not expecting that level of efficiency to sustain season over season over season, because that is just math. That's just understanding how you identify an outlier. But with Mark Andrews, the thesis behind the play was that you're seeing him as a player that was highly efficient on his snaps. And even if the efficiency dips, what you're going to find is you're going to find him getting significantly more snaps this upcoming season. And then that was how he was supposed to hit in fantasy. So obviously he has a poor season. Obviously he deals with some drops, but nonetheless, I think that what you're going to be finding here is you're going to be finding Mark Andrews as an option that you're not too interested in fantasy drafts. Unless you draft Lamar Jackson, then I'm all in on Mark Andrews. If not, maybe go with a Hawkinson, maybe go with the Noah Fant a couple rounds after. But no, I think Mark Andrews is a great option to stack if you draft Lamar Jackson. Now, our next wide receiver, let's talk about Hollywood Brown here. Now, with Hollywood Brown, what was crazy is the passing volume that he got in 2020. Now, I understand if you look at his raw targets, it's nothing to jump up and down for. But what was surprising is Hollywood Brown had 26.6% of the targets in Baltimore this past year. Now, if you hear that target percentage, I don't know how familiar y'all are with these stats. Literally, that's Devontae Adams. That's Michael Thomas. That is peak Antonio Brown. That is the level of the volume that you are going to be expecting from those elite stud wide receivers. Now, you're never expecting that with a Hollywood Brown. I mean, Hollywood Brown doesn't have the talent to do that. Hollywood Brown is a speedy field stretcher. He was miscast in a wide receiver 1 role simply because they had no other options. I mean, really, were they going to be playing Willie Snead in a role where they're getting him 25% of the targets? They already gave Mark Andrews a ton of value with 23% of the team's targets in his own right. So really, they had no option but to play Hollywood Brown in that high volume role, which allowed the defense to key in on him. And y'all know I always talk about volume, volume, volume. It's the only thing that matters in fantasy 99% of the time. But the very rare case where volume doesn't matter as much is when you're discussing these field stretching wide receivers that you know they're never going to win with volume. The only field stretching wide receivers that you have ever seen win with volume and throughout really the entire history of playing fantasy football was peak Deshaun Jackson and Tyreek Hill. I mean, those were the two speedy wide receivers that have been able to win with volume compared to winning with efficiency. Now with Hollywood Brown, he's not going to be asked to burden that wide receiver role where he's going to be getting more than 25% of his team's targets this upcoming season because now they have better options on the team. They should be able to take defensive attention away from him, and they should be able to provide him with a few spike plays this season. Now, because we're looking for spike plays and efficiency with Hollywood Brown, I will say that we're not necessarily going to be jumping up and down to draft him in a traditional redraft league, but where you want Hollywood is best ball, best ball, best ball. And I know that it's a lazy form of analysis. I know that it's easy to say I prefer this wide receiver better in best ball, but no, Hollywood Brown is the definition of that. I mean, if you take Lamar in the 5th, if you can get Hollywood Brown in the 10th round, I mean, that is a smash for a wide receiver that's going to be playing every single snap given his speed. Now, the last player I want to talk about here as being a potential stat candidate is going to be Rashod Bateman. Now, Rashod Bateman, fantastic profile. Of course, we were making fun of a lot of people for having him ranked over a Devonta Smith earlier this offseason. So we have given Rashod Bateman some hate, but I mean, if you zoom out, he checks every single box you'd look for. Only 21 years old. He goes with the 27th pick overall. And coming out of Minnesota, I mean, this is a player that you do expect to play that X wide receiver role. You do expect him to be someone that can get 20% of his team's targets. Obviously, the situation is very bad going to the Baltimore Ravens because the passing volume isn't going to be through the roof. But here, it's going to be a very similar situation. If you were playing in a best ball format and you can get Lamar Jackson in the 5th round and you possibly miss out on a Hollywood Brown in the 10th, in that scenario, I'm fine taking Rashod Bateman in rounds 13, 14, understanding that you're getting those potential spike weeks, even if the passing volume is going to be lower for the overall offense. Now, thank you guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. I really hope y'all got something from it. Of course, if y'all did, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a lot, and I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. Thank you so much for everybody supporting the show. In John, Raymond, Jordan, Andrew, Walter, Dwayne, Evan, Eamon, Q, and Use the Nerd. Thank you guys.